Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So it has been a few years since I have worked the help desk. And one of the things that we did that most organizations do at the help desk level is when an employee gets terminated or released, you have to offboard them. And most organizations have a checklist to do that. But it's always good to go over and review what some of those recommendations might be, because I found this article from a friend of the show, a Practical 365 blog, which I was on their podcast a few months ago. This was written by someone named James Yip, and as well as Microsoft has a formal Learn document that also goes through on how to remove former employees. And, taking a look at them, there's a couple different things. So I think it's always good to check your termination checklist and what you do compared to what others might do, what Microsoft might recommend. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing is really interesting on both of the Learn document and in James' blog post. It says to go into M365 and block the user explicitly. I've actually never done this step as a first step. I've always just gone on to AD and disabled the users, which is like step 3 in kind of what the lists go through. But they go through and they say, first thing you do is to go ahead and block the sign in via the M365 admin. And this will block the user from signing in any new sign-ins into the system. However, any existing sign-ins will still be there for 60-ish minutes, depending on when it was done, which is just part of the authentication process. And so what you could do is go ahead and force all of those sessions to be logged out immediately. There is a Microsoft Graph PowerShell commandlet to do this. It's called revoke MG user sign-in sessions. And so you can go ahead and revoke all those sessions via PowerShell. And then you know that not only are they blocked from new sign-ins, the existing sign-ins will be forced to log.
I want to make one point there. So Microsoft has been migrating all of its applications to something called Continuous Access Evaluation, or CAE. And one of the benefits of that versus the old model, where Andy mentioned in passing the 60 minutes potential maximum lifetime, CAE can revoke access in near real time. And so that commandlet will help with that. However, not everything uses continuous access evaluation today. You may find some applications that don't. And third-party applications are out of scope for it because they use SAML instead of things like OpenID Connect. And so depending on the mix of applications the user uses, there is the possibility of some tokens still having some lifetime left in them that can't be revoked, whether it's an access token that can't be revoked in kind of old school OpenID Connect, whether it's SAML token lifetimes that can't be revoked, whatever the case may be. Don't be shocked if you run into some scenarios where a user stays in for a little bit after you have done both of these steps, the block, sign in, and revoke all sign-in sessions with the PowerShell commandlet. There's just not a magic silver bullet that invalidates everything in one shot. However, within about 60 minutes at the most, the user should be unable to access anything.
Yeah, and this is on the cloud side. So the next thing that actually Microsoft recommends is to save the contents of the mailbox if needed. We're going to talk about more on the data itself, but if there is a need to keep the contents of the mailbox for specifically like litigation, you can use a litigation hold or an in-place hold on the mailbox before the user is deleted. That way the contents will stay. Now, if your enterprise plan, your M365 plan includes archiving and legal hold, and litigation might be a possibility, and you have a technically strong IT department, this is the best method to maintain and retain the contents of the mailbox. The biggest thing that you have to remember, though, is when you convert the mailbox to an inactive mailbox through litigation, or a legal hold, I should say, only administrators, compliance officers, records management managers can view the contents of that mailbox through in-place e-discovery tools in Exchange Online. Nobody else can. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you need to view the contents, if you do it through a legal hold within the Microsoft Purview, which is the compliance portal, then only the compliance administrators and global admins will have access to the mailbox via the e-discovery tools and content search within Purview. There are other ways, I think it's pretty well known, that you can convert the user's mailbox into a shared mailbox. If you do that, then again, all the existing email and calendars will be retained, and you can assign people to it just like any other shared mailbox. One thing to remember with this is that you can at some point revert it back to a private mailbox if needed. However, if that mailbox is over 50 gigabytes, then you'll need to assign a license to it. If it's under 50 gigs, you do not need to assign a license to it. And then finally, you can also just forward the email to another employee like the manager or a peer to monitor in case there's things that are ongoing if you don't want to convert it to a shared mailbox. As I said before, my first step was always to disable the on-premise AD account. And if it is an on-premise ID, you eventually will need to do this because that ID is always, if it's a synced ID, you're going to have to disable it on-prem. And then, of course, make sure that you probably do an Entra Connect dir sync, right, to make sure that the synchronization is done. Otherwise, you could wait, but if you wait, it might be up to an hour before the dir sync happens. And so you'll probably have to manually push a dir sync, which requires an administrator at some point. I think it's an Exchange administrator in order to do that. A couple other things on the list. Some people do this. They can reset the user's password to something random. I think that's like a CYA thing to make sure that the terminated employee doesn't have their password anymore. So you just set it to something random.
Well, and that's another benefit too. When you change a user's password and it does synchronize to Entra ID, that also invalidates all of their current access tokens. So if your script failed, the commandlet didn't work, the resetting password is kind of how you described it, Andy, a CYA, where if any of these steps fail, the disabling this or that, it kind of is that belt and suspenders approach to it. So it has a lot of useful benefits. You should definitely do it.
When it comes to the devices, a lot of different options. If you're using Intune, you can submit a selective app or device wipe, retire the device and wipe it within Intune. Definitely want to do this for any, most of the time it's mobile devices. I think most companies will use Intune when they at least start with Intune. It's iOS and Android. Very easy to do, to just send the wipe and reset from the portal. And now that only will wipe the corporate data. It doesn't wipe the device itself. So just make sure that you select that. You can also use an active sync wipe request as well. A lot of times if Intune is not deployed or the end user is using a non-Microsoft app, like the Mail app built into iOS, or say the Gmail app within Outlook to view their corporate email, then they might be using ActiveSync to retrieve the mailbox contents. And so you can perform a ActiveSync wipe as well. If you're using Intune to manage, say, desktop operating systems, so Windows or Mac OS, you can again do the wipe of the device within Intune. I think where it gets a little bit more difficult is if you are using on-premise, like domain joined or hybrid domain joined devices. Obviously, if they're within the office, you can just retrieve the device and have at it, whatever you need to do with the device, either retrieve contents of the locally, or you would just go ahead and wipe the device. If the user is remote, that gets a little bit more difficult. You can disable the computer object within AD, but the device needs to have line of sight to AD in order to get that computer disabled, because by default, if it's domain joined or hybrid domain joined, the user's credentials are cached when the user logs in. And I think it's like 30 days or something like that before the device loses domain trust, or it could be even longer than that. So if they don't connect to, say, VPN or something like that, which if you disable their account, that might just automatically, not be able to connect to VPN. And so now they won't be able to have line of sight, but they'll still be able to use their device. That gets a little bit kludgy. So, kind of, I don't know what organizations do if they have remote workers. They just like request them to send it in, but there's no guarantee that they're not continuing to use the information. They wouldn't be able to access stuff in M365, but anything that they have locally, especially if they're not using some sort of DLP or sensitivity labels within M365, that those contents are just free game, right?
Let me take a couple more kicks at that dead horse. Hearing you walk through all of these dependencies and these layers of dependencies, and if you turn this off, then this might break and you don't have line of sight. Just cloud join your devices. Just cloud manage your devices. In a modern, go anywhere, do anything workplace, you can't have these 1999, 2000 era dependencies where you assume every device sits on the same corporate network the whole time. It's crazy. It's time to modernize. So here's yet another little shove in that direction, because to your point, Andy, I mean, my goodness, you kind of have to almost draw an architecture diagram to figure out how your dependencies are layered and in what order you have to do things in. And it's like booting up the orbital lander in Apollo 13 or whatever, when they had to go through the checklist in exactly the right order. Otherwise it would blow the circuits. I mean, it's kind of crazy at this point. So cloud join your devices.
Yeah. I think obviously if you're using domain joined devices in a fashion that we used to do it, where everyone would go to the office and be on the corporate internet and you can just grab the device from the user, that's fine. But in this day and age with remote workers, that's where I think it starts to really get difficult to ensure, right? Like, you have some sort of trust if the user is leaving the organization and it's all good. But what happens if it's a contentious termination and they're remote? How are you going to get that device without guaranteeing some sort of data integrity without anything being leaked? It's very difficult unless you're using other things like Purview. Like, for example, with Microsoft, at Microsoft, because Adam and I do work for Microsoft, if you're listeners of the show, everything that we do in M365 is automatically labeled. And if there is sensitive information that is discovered, it gets labeled with a sensitivity label that's higher confidentiality, more confident or sensitive or whatever, and that is encrypted. And so if someone leaves the organization and you still have that data on your device, say it's domain joined. We don't really have that anymore, but say it is, and I have that information. Well, as soon as I try to access the information, it checks the cloud for my active account. And if I don't have an active account and I can't authenticate to it anymore, guess what? I can't access that data. I can't access that PowerPoint. I can't access that Word document. So there are ways to mitigate the risk, but as Adam and I have discussed on this show, data protection and data security has almost always been extremely low on the totem pole. So if you're still using hybrid joined devices, I highly doubt that you have a mature data protection, data security program where you're actually doing DLP and labeling documents. So that's where I'm saying, like, that is, like Adam says, give you the little nudge to move into that cloud managed device, because it's just going to get a lot easier. When it comes to OneDrive for Business, let's say you are using OneDrive for Business. If you're using something else, you'll have ways to assign someone else that data. I know that at a previous organization, we used Box, and there is ways to essentially assign someone else to their Box data. Just like that, in Microsoft, you can do delegation for OneDrive for Business. So you can authorize another user, usually like their direct manager or something like that, to have access to that employee's OneDrive for Business, which allows you to recover the files. And then, of course, you always want to remove their M365 license. If they're terminated, no need to continue to have the license unless for some reason you need to continue to log in to their account. I do know that there are exceptions when, for some reason you need to keep that user active, you need to continue to log in. But like I said here, you can delegate on OneDrive for Business. You can do that, assign someone else for their SharePoint, so on and so forth. So once you remove the license, at some point you can remove the user account. You can either delete it. I know some organizations don't like deleting users, but I don't know. I don't see a reason why you need to keep the account if they're not there anymore after a certain period of time. Maybe you can wait 90 days and then remove the account. But I see old accounts sitting in either Active Directory or M365 as a risk itself. Because if the account is there, most of the time you haven't removed permissions to everything for that account, and there's something that's hidden or whatever. And if an attacker comes by, they are able to get access to the account. They might have access that you don't know about. So I always think at some point you need to do a cleanup and remove the account completely.
Yeah, agree. That is still attack surface effectively. And even if you're doing a lot of the things we've talked about, you're disabling it, you're changing the password belt and suspenders approach. To your point, Andy, it still may have latent permissions, and it's not impossible for an attacker effectively to very silently re-enable that account and change the password and blend right in with the day-to-day activities of the help desk. And now they have a user account that no one's really monitoring, isn't going to really arise any suspicion unless somebody's really paying attention. And yeah, pretty nice way in to gain some lateral movement or an initial foothold. So I agree. You don't want those hanging out long term.
I actually got this question from an organization that's looking at purview sensitive information labels, which is, what happens if I'm the owner of an encrypted document, a highly sensitive information document, or I've shared it with Adam, and it's only the two of us who are collaborating on this super secret document, and one of us gets let go. How do you take care of those issues? Because now the person who is managing the document or has access has left the organization.
Well, and before you unpack how to solve for this esoteric possibility, the first response you would get would be, don't do that. Don't allow users to create custom permissions. They should instead be using a defined label. And if it is a very small group of people who should have access to that sensitivity label, so be it. Certainly, organizations have things like pre-release earnings when they're a publicly traded company, and very few people can see those before they're released to Wall Street. It's a legal compliance thing, an SEC compliance thing. You would still not just let your people in your finance group just create custom permissions. You would have a label defined for them. In general, don't do this. It is very recommended against letting users create custom permissions. But if you do, and there's, to Andy's point, a set of one or two people who can read it, then what do? There is a solution.
Yeah. And it isn't very smooth, I should say. I've never actually done it in mass. But the thing is that it's pretty rare that, like Adam said, it's pretty rare that this happens. And it's even more rare that there's multiple things that you need to do all at once. So James, in his article, wrote about this, and I've also had some experience with this in the past. There is something called a super user within the Azure RMS rights management service. It's a very special user. And when you set it up, I don't think there's actually anyone who's assigned to that user. You have to actually assign specific people to that user, and then you have to escalate to that when you need it. So it's something to monitor and be really controlled about it, because again, it does have these super user rights, and the rights include downgrading or removing the sensitivity label completely. So you can unencrypt it if you need to and open up the permissions. So it's essentially just a super user. You get to do whatever you want when it comes to that rights management of a document, any M365 content that has sensitivity labels to it. You can do whatever you need to do to it. So when, if this ever comes up, you can make sure that, number one, have a super user assigned, which I believe you need a global admin in order to do that. And there are two different permissions. Just because you have global admin does not mean that you have super user Azure Rights Management Service powers. So you got to assign someone to it. And then if the time comes, you can use that power to give access to the document if needed.
Yeah, you should have your alerting set up on this almost like it's a honeypot. If someone is using this, it should set off all sorts of flashing lights and warning bells and everything else because of how powerful it is. And again, if you're doing it right, it should be so rarely needed. It should almost be like a break glass account, same thing. I mean, like the honeypot, it should set off everything if it gets touched because it should not in normal circumstances. So it's there, but it's behind the glass case. It's break in case of emergency. Don't use this on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly. And then a couple other things to keep in mind. This was also from James, and I thought it was really good stuff. As you have more things deployed within M365, you accumulate more and more data. And so there might be some other things that you might want to address when you're removing user accounts. For example, meeting recordings. If the meeting is organized by the user that's getting terminated, that's usually stored in their OneDrive. I'm not sure a lot of people are actually aware of that. So you might want to consider moving those files before the user is disabled to, like, say, a SharePoint site. And then Teams chats are also stored on Microsoft Teams servers. And so if you want to have a copy of whoever's taking over that terminated user's work, you might want to do like an export of all the references, messages, just in case. So yeah, so those are a few things to keep in mind. But overall, I thought this was a really good overview and just kind of a review, because there were some things in here that I hadn't done at previous organizations when I worked the help desk. And so I thought this was really good to review, especially there have been new things that have been added over the years, new services. Like at previous organizations, I wasn't using Teams. And so, and we didn't record meetings a lot. So like stuff like that. I think it's always good to take a look. So I learned a lot, and hopefully, listening to this, you might double check your employee termination checklist.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Teams recordings being part of OneDrive, we covered OneDrive delegation and thinking about that already. That would be inclusive of that. And then just one other note on the Teams chat. I think your call out is good. You could use eDiscovery to do an export if you want to share it with, say, a new person coming on board, so they have that historical context. But just a clarifying point, and this isn't terribly relevant, but I think our listener and viewer base would find this interesting. Teams chats are actually stored in two different locations. So if it's like a one-on-one chat or even just a group chat with me and some other people, and it's outside the context of a team, then those are stored in my Exchange mailbox. They're part of that, which makes sense because it's the same concept as I'm sending messages to other people like as Adam. However, if I'm conversing in a chat that's part of a team, then those are stored with the Teams files actually in SharePoint Online. And in also there's like an Exchange shared mailbox kind of thing under the covers too. And it's kind of split between those. eDiscovery knows where to find it, so it's not terribly relevant to you. But just in case you were curious, Teams for the most part does a lot of its underlying storage and management and inherits all of that from Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive, which is why it kind of shipped out of the box with a pretty full feature set of like compliance and retention and all those features, because it inherited them. Anyhow, just I always find that interesting and like to point that out to folks that there isn't really like a quote unquote separate Teams data store. It's actually generally an Exchange or SharePoint Online.
All right. Well, hopefully everyone learned something today. That's our episode. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes, as well as the links to the Learn document and James' blog. the Practical 3. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just email us or hit us up on our socials. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.